In cooperation with Los Angeles Cable Television Association and LA 36, University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication presents this ongoing series of speakers on topics of current interest in the fields of media and communications. Today, Robin Mansell of the London School of Economics and Political Science presents an analysis on how new information technologies are and will affect societies around the globe.
Robin Mansell is exceptionally well known to those of us in the international communications and telecommunications area. She is the Dixons Chair in New Media at the London School of Economics and Politics. She is also this year the head of the Department of Media Communications, which is a new unit created only at the beginning of this academic year at LSE that acknowledges the importance of media and communications within the broader London School of Economics. She is a prolific author, most recently of the edited volume Inside the Communication Revolution, and her last book was Mobilizing the Information Society, Strategies for Growth and Opportunity. And it should probably be noted as well that she is the former research director at Science Policy Research at Sussex University, from which some of the information and analysis that is presented in this lecture is drawn from that other lifetime. It is a great honor, a pleasure to welcome you here today.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a great honor to be standing in front of such an august audience. And I don't know, perhaps I'm going where angels and fools should never tread, because I'm in an audience where I have been invited, particularly on this occasion, to talk about the conceptual framework, if you like, that we might use to better understand what on earth is meant about a global information society. And I do this in the presence of perhaps one of the biggest contributors to this whole debate, who is Manuel Castells, and so I hope that maybe out of what I say we can down and have a discussion and a debate. What I want to do today is to just give you an idea of the structure of this talk. I'm going to give you a very brief history of why it is that I think that global information societies debates are so high on the international agenda today. The second thing I want to do is talk a little bit about why all of this might matter, whether it's high on the agenda or not. Third thing is to talk about some of the dominant frames, if you like, conceptual frameworks, which are really influencing those debates about what a global information society is or is not, and some of the alternative perspectives that we might actually draw upon in order to really move forward in our understanding of how these kinds of societies might evolve, not just in the United States, but around the world. Next. But it's always really important to make a thought somehow local or specific. I come all the way across the Atlantic, but I was thinking to myself, this is the kind of discussion which is going on or will go on next week at what's called the World Summit on the Information Society. The UN General Assembly resolution that led to this big meeting with many different players in Geneva next week said global information society is evolving at breakneck speed. It's perhaps the greatest thing that humanity has ever experienced. Now, it seems to me that there's a bit of hyperbole in that. I think all of you will rather think that. Anyone who's a critical scholar will say, goodness gracious, maybe that's over the top. But then you think about, well, where does some of it come from? It comes from USA Today, which has big full-page adverts that say, content is knowledge and knowledge is power. Believe it, it's true. Where does this come from? I mean, we really need to unpick some of these things. The build-up to the UN World Summit was quite long. Over the last decade or so, UN agency after UN agency has published big reports, usually this thick, in 10-point type, of best practice case studies on how information and communication technologies, and particularly the internet, is really the key to everything you can think of. Poverty alleviation, human well-being, development of new societies in which knowledge matters, in which information sharing may be possible, in which we have better prospects, not only for the wealthy, but also for the poor. These documents have been promoted by heads of state, certainly by the producers of the hardware and software of the so-called Internet age, but also by many different people who may go under the title of civil society movements. There is a big crescendo of belief that somehow, whatever we might mean by an information society, it is really something that we have to pay attention to. And so this came to a head with the decisions by the UN agencies to back a World Summit. A World Summit, so usually things that happen when you're talking about gender issues. World Summits happen around environmental issues. And we all agree that these are really key issues. What do you do if you're trying to have a World Summit on information society? It's a nebulous concept. And so what I want to do as we go through this is not so much talk about the World Summit itself, but what may lie behind some of this. Why does it matter? I think the reason why it's important to pay attention to not only what's happening at the World Summit, but at all levels what is happening with regard to the evolution, if you like, of something called information society. And we know that we have a lot of tools that have been developed. We know that we have exponentially increasing computing power. We know that we have open software, proprietary software, and applications, and new games. We have new kinds of virtual communities. We have a lot of tools, which people like to talk about. But what is less talked about is the fact that in addition to the tools, we need a whole lot of measures to assemble, if you like, the human capabilities and related technologies. And when I say technologies now, I'm not talking so much about the hardware and software, but I'm talking more about technologies, social technologies, the institutions, the practices, the routines, what Foucault might mean by technology. These need to be developed in order to make the best use of the new opportunities offered by ICT. Now, I don't think anybody would really disagree with that. But when you actually ask what is best use, and what do we really mean by human capabilities or related technologies, that's when we run into a problem of a bit of a conceptual black box. And it's not a black box, rather a divided opinion when it comes to the scholarly community, I would argue. But also a whole lot of common sense discussion about information societies. It seems to me that that's one answer, and it's obviously a bit self-serving. That one comes from me and a colleague some years ago. There are other answers, as I was implying a minute ago. There are the issues that it matters because of poverty reduction. If ICTs can be helpful in that regard, that would be a good thing. Further answers. If ICTs are applied for best uses, we might see economic growth and maybe even greater distributional equity if we get the institutions right. There might be some connection between all of this and social welfare goals. So these are all things which might be connected. Why it matters to talk about information societies. This is where I come to the rather more controversial part of this talk in terms of unpicking what best use really means. Because it seems to me, and I think to anyone who has really surveyed the academic literature, not just in North America, but really around the world, there's a dominant set of voices. And the main voices would argue that we need to promote information societies because we need to promote competitiveness and reliance on something called a knowledge-based economy. What this really means is it's shorthand for saying we need investment in market-led growth in these technologies and industries. We need to really favor a sort of a conventional diffusion model. If we leave it all to the market, surely the internet and new software applications will diffuse, and these will lead to good outcomes. What we need to do is benchmark, if you like. We need metrics to count how fast different societies are getting on the information society bandwagon. It's one set of voices. What these people tend to emphasize primarily is the knowledge or information commodity aspect of these developments. And these people generally are strong advocates of ever stronger intellectual property protection. What this means is that essentially they see an innovation model in these new technology areas where the incentives for content production basically come from making money, economic returns on the creative process. and not really from a general increase in social welfare. This is what the dominant voices would be arguing. What do they underemphasize? Well, what most of you in this room might also be interested in, the social character of what John Rawls has called the informational economy, or the network of networks, and the communicative relationships, which are actually the social glue or the cultural kind of environment in which these information societies are developing. This is what gets completely underemphasized by the main dominant voices. This conceptual framework, well, where does it come from? And I won't spend too much time on this because for many of you will be quite familiar with it. But just to make sure we know who the dominant voices are. First of all, there's a very, very strong techno-economic technology push echo behind the argument about competitiveness and knowledge-based economies. If you look in terms of the European Community's R&D framework programs, it's very much technology push, notwithstanding their concerns about what somebody or people call youth. It's still push technology. If you look at the National Science Foundation spending, I think, certainly in some areas, like on electronic commerce and what have you, it's very much technology push, even when it's talking about best practices and what have you. It's still very much the technology. Big emphasis on online service evolution, but again, market-led. So no responsibility on the service providers for things like privacy protection, security of networks, damage to other human beings as a result of the social communities that use these networks. They don't have any responsibility. It's market-led, and anything other than that is a threat to two things. One, the original libertarian ethos of the Internet, and two, basically, people's understandings of human rights. That nobody should intrude in this open network environment. This conceptual framework comes out of traditional technology innovation studies, which assumes that the key to stimulating growth in this area is global trade and economic growth, which links up the whole debate of the World Trade Organization with market liberalization, stimulating competitiveness, and that's all there is, guys. The social isn't there. Disciplinary focus for all of this is both theoretically and empirically, mainly from economics, though not exclusively. And three particular fields of economics, I think, particularly growing. Both industries are expansive. One comes from industrial dynamics. And here there's a huge amount of research and money being poured into research on modeling and simulating networks, why they come into being, why they stabilize, why they go out of being. But this particular work that I'm thinking about in industrial dynamics is all about firms. There's nothing else. There's technology and there's firms. Where are the other social actors? Agents of government, civil society actors, etc. So although this is a growing area, and its names, if you like, Paul David, Dominique Faure in France, Robin Cowan, who's in Canada, these people are getting a lot of money to do a lot of research on a key theme which really matters, but it's very one-sided. The new institutional economics work, people like Eric Brousseau, Oliver Williamson have developed a lot of interesting work on transaction cost theory and an understanding of why it is that firms, again, mainly firms, choose to develop networks and new forms of governance, which basically add up to a new form of global information economy. And we'll do a lot of work on electronic commerce and the development of those services. And it's very interesting work. In this country, people like Ralph Wiggin and Charles Steinfeld are among the contributors to this. But it's all about competitiveness and efficiency gains in something called the global information society. And lastly, the evolutionary economics tradition, which branching comes in a number of different hues, but the one that I think is most significant and growing at the moment is that which comes out of complex systems theory, which is about emergent properties. And it's very interesting. In fact, it's very fascinating. But at the end of the day, it's orthogonal, it seems to me, with thinking about some of the social aspects, the social welfare aspects. And it's very much about how these emergent properties and networks give rise to new opportunities. But you have to sort of wait, because of the complexity of the whole area, doesn't give you any levers, if you like, for actually acting differently with regard to the institutions and practices and the way people live their everyday lives in these new network environments. So, again, in this mainstream tradition that I'm talking about, very little attention gets paid to these important things. To learning, to communities of practice, how they differ, how they are actually exchanging information, which purposes of mediation, which I'll come back to in a minute, which is a concept that most of you will be familiar with. Very quickly then, who are the proponents? Well, when one is asked to give a talk, one always overstates the case, so you will be thinking, but I know people in these areas who don't say this. But in the main, it would strike me that in economics departments, management schools, business schools, information computing systems departments, this is where a lot of this work is coming from. It's also true that this is a perspective, the emphasis on straightforward innovation and market-led development that many, but not all, industry leaders are concerned about. Firms from Time Warner to Bertelsmann, Microsoft, Motorola, Nokia, all these firms will be more or less backing this kind of argument. And it also comes mainly from industrialized country governments and government leaders who want to see information societies flourish and have usually benchmarks and targets for that happening. It's not exclusively industrialized countries. There are developing countries who also, for one reason or another, have decided that this mainstream story is one to be favored. And I was watching CNN last night, and although I was jet-lagged, I sort of sat up and I said, Senegal has just announced that it wants to introduce a regime for global information society which will emphasize the enforcement of intellectual property rights much more strongly than in the past. Why? Because the president has decided that e-learning can help the people, which probably is true. But will it be as cheap as it could be if we had a different institutional regime? Probably not. So let's change topics here and talk a little bit more about what I would argue, at least, is a much more open and provoking set of research issues and a conceptual framework for thinking about the problem of what is or should be the global information society. And it seems to me here there's a very rich set of traditions that we can draw upon, primarily coming from fields called science, technology, and innovation studies and science, technology, and society studies. In the latter case, if you think of people like Leica, who's written on new technologies and innovation, if you think about people like Judy Wiseman, who's talked about new technologies and gender issues, if you think about people like Lab and Wegner, who've talked about communities of practices, and always in the specific case of the internet and the new media, but they have very interesting things to say about why and how do values and preferences become involved in very instantiation, if you like, of new technologies. They have very interesting things to say about whose values and preferences get embedded in the new technologies. If you think of the science, technology, and innovation studies work that's been done in the United States by people like Richard Nelson, by Nathan Rosenberg, in Europe by people like Chris Freeman, and various others, you can think of the fact that they have asked over the years very profound questions about what human values and preferences get designed into the very architecture of both older and newer technologies. And they go further than that, and they ask, in fact, both traditions go further than that, I would argue, what scope is there for embedding alternatives to the dominant guiding principles in our information societies? They ask about technologies historically as well. So they would say, well, if the dominant voices are saying efficiency, competitiveness, market liberalization, a particular form for the regulation, if you like, of the new technologies like the internet, what alternatives are there and how can we speak about them? Culturally, socially, politically, in terms of governance. Is it possible to even imagine that we could have some kind of coexistence of network environments and global information societies that reflect, on the one hand, definitely the interest of those who want to have a direct benefit in terms of money from their labor, and also those who are more open to open principles. So what this whole tradition, and what I'm arguing is an alternative conceptual framework, insists on, is that technological innovations, no matter what they are, but certainly with regard to the internet and new media, are humanly constituted, which in this case happens to be Nicholas Garner's phrase, which he used in 1990 with regard to the older media. But he also used it again in his book in 2001 to talk about the fact that we must remember that these are humanly constituted technologies. And if that is the case, we all have a legitimate interest in what are the guiding principles, values, and preferences. Not just us as scholars, but us and people who are not in this room, who are citizens, who have a reason to care what kind of society we live in. So that's not the end of the conceptual framework, though, because although I worked for 15 years in the field of science and technology innovation, I also was trained as a media and communications person once upon a time, and am now back in that kind of department. And what is at the core of so much of what we talk about in terms of understanding the social processes, the dynamics of networks in the media and communications area? Well, one thing that's at the core is this whole notion of technological mediation. And if you think of people like Thompson, Cambridge in the UK, if you think of Roger Silverstone, who will be with you soon, and you might not know, but I've also used the term mediation in my work on Inside the Communication Revolution as a way of understanding something which is hard to put your finger on in terms of a construct. But it does do so much in our studies in this area to open up for debate the fact that there is no simple structural linkages between technologies and people. Whatever we think about informational or communicative environments, what we have to always remember is that there's processes of accommodation and there are processes of resistance, and that those vary by time and place. People understand these new mediated worlds in remarkably different ways, and that we have to unpack the kinds of issues that need to be debated and not simply listen to the dominant voices, or indeed necessarily the more critical voices, so that we can begin to understand something about mediated relationships when power is being articulated both within and between individuals, but also between collective groupings in both market and non-market contexts. In other words, we need to have a much more both-and approach to understanding global information societies, not an either-or one. And I would also say that what we need to understand is how power is distributed and changes. What are people's, what organizations, firms, societies, governments, strategic interests with respect to the kinds of values and preferences that we want to see constituted by information societies. Now that's a big set of questions. It seems to me the conceptual framework, and the point that I'm making here is that it is open to more than one view of the world, that it opens research questions up a lot more than the mainstream traditions do. And I'm going to give you an example of how that works by coming back to the issue of intellectual property protection, because I think it makes quite concrete the openness of the debate that you can have instead of the one-sided war between competing factions. So let's take the issue of intellectual property protection and the whole set of debates about copyright. And we think about them from the kind of framework which I was suggesting, where we're interested in values and preferences in an innovation studies kind of context, and we're interested in mediation kinds of issues. The first thing that happens is that we realize that digital rights management systems, tightening up the IPR protections, are only valued by some actors and not by others. And the subject who values these approaches depends on what their strategic interests are. So we have a set of research questions. You can actually go and see what some of the contending interests are. You can also see that market-led development exclude many from contributing, being actual contributors to the content of the global information societies. Why? Because intellectual property rights protection provides incentives to some to produce original content, and not others. Who are the some? Well, the some are usually the bigger producers. What happens to the rest? They exist in an environment where I don't think it would be putting it too finely to say there's uncertainty, there's fear of legal action, The case in point is in the press all of the time. But it's, again, reading USA Today this morning, 41 more people, individuals, charged in the United States for downloading music. It's 364 children and others who have been charged for downloading music. Can you believe it? I mean, it's just amazing.
Content is 65 million. So
exactly. Now, the press would have you believe that now people are learning their lessons. They are really beginning to understand that they need to be passive consumers of information from the Internet. Because if they're not passive, if they dare to recirculate or republish information on the Internet, even think about it, they'll be charged. And they'll have to pay $1,000, $3,000, who knows how much. These are just ordinary people. They're not the wealthy. So if that isn't an incentive for some to produce information and not for others, well, I don't know. The point is that those who want to assemble, modify, build upon the content that is part and parcel of information societies, having these particular IPR regimes that are in place and being pushed around the world now is a disincentive to do creative things. Dominant values run against combining information in global information societies. They run against the kind of information commons approach which Larry Lessig and various others are the advocates of. The polarization of the debate that seems to happen using existing dominant conceptual frameworks is you get the people supporting the Bendy's position over on this side, and you get Larry Lessig standing over there, as I was privileged to see here 2 years ago. And it's a punch up, basically. Is this how scholarly debate and research should take place? A series of punch ups? Well, I think not. So how can we, I've got to give you a bit of picture of entertainment to make sure you all understand my point. Here we are now. These are guys who want strong intellectual property protection. They want direct revenues from the fruits of intellectual creations, whether it's films or whatever it is. And there's a bunch of fairly interesting indirect revenue people. These are the ones who would put their intellectual products into the public domain, but they also sell some services on the side, like manuals, packaging, understanding how to do gaming and things like that. So they'll sell services and certainly be market-led. But then there's the whole public domain. And the public domain here is smaller, not because there's not millions and millions of Internet users out there who are citizens and people, but because it is basically the public domain, which is small in terms of having the possibility of contributing in ways that can actually be heard. You can have dozens and hundreds of thousands of web logs. But how many people know about these sites? If you're talking about informational kinds of economies in which people pay attention and are influenced by things, I would argue that this is still pretty small. And the question is, as we move forward in terms of intellectual property rights protections, is do we stay the same, or do we get a world in which the public domain grows, and is complementary to probably a fairly creative way of generating money through intellectual products on the Internet, an indirect revenue approach, or do these guys actually shrink? Well, without stating any preferences, I would say that maybe we want to have a world in which there are many different possibilities. And in the world we're living in now, there is the kind of clamped down passive model of information production and consumption. So to come back to the analytical point, it seems to me that the research agenda that I was talking about, which rests on mediation on the one hand and on understanding innovation, concept, and relation processes on the other hand, is one that has to be open to a range of social values and preferences. And when it is, it's possible to actually think about the analysis of complementarity rather than substitution, no more punch-ups, complementarities between the strategic interests of those who might favor proprietary software, for instance, as well as those favoring open source software, who might favor, on the one hand, tightening IPRs on the one hand and relaxing it on the other hand, who might be willing to see and imagine a growing public sphere or commons which would support socially valued technology development, as well as those who would favor market-led development. Now, it seems to me that if you're going to say things like that, the only way to be taken not to be a totally naive person who's standing up saying, I wish the world was other than it was, is to make some concrete suggestions for policy. And that is, I think, one of the things which we've been involved in, certainly in Europe, in a recent research project for the European Commission, is to actually come up with some scenarios for them to think about what might be possible for having regime change. And so the first scenario that we presented in terms of this dilemma of how to evolve a more balanced, if you like, information society was to say, well, if we carry on like we are, we're going to have ceaseless conflict between those who want to generate revenues through its tightened intellectual property protection and those who want to defeat them. The creative juices of the hacktivism type of people are something that's never going to go away. Certainly not, as long as they see barriers being put before them at every turn. And it's not just them. It is other thinking human beings who want genuinely to change the way in which they engage in social networking by using the new tools. So that's what's probable, unless something happens. Something else could happen. There could be a major effort to extend what's usually called the fair use provisions to allow republication for non-commercial purposes. It could be costly in terms of compensation for the existing intellectual property owners, but it would have a possibility of at least widening the space where some people who are currently restricted from republishing information could do more of it. Now, if you took the United States context, I think you can almost imagine a world in which there could be a lot of lobbying going on to begin to extend your existing fair use principles, both in the scientific domains and the educational domains. But this is not something that you can export around the world, because if you look at Europe, we've virtually lost any notion of fair use provisions, not totally, but to the point where it becomes absolutely ludicrous, and that any commentary to allow republication for whatever purpose is seen as a direct infringement and a threat to the copyright owners. And all you have to do is ask your global media students when they come back from LSE this year just how bad it is in terms of the restrictive environment on allowing republication on the web or anywhere else, even if it's done outside the country, in order to gain access to materials, to read, even just to read materials. Another instance of how bad it is elsewhere in Europe is at University of Sussex. If you go to the library and you get an article, just photocopy it for your own purposes as a scholar, because you're going to cite that article in an article that you will write, you will be charged £9 in addition to the photocopy cost, according to the new licensing arrangements in the UK. That's their interpretation of this. Now, this is worse than passive consumption of information. Right, exactly. I mean, this is the real world. And so advocating something relatively sensible, like extending fair use provisions, is actually just sort of walking around saying this is a good suggestion, but nobody is really going to do it. There's too many strategic interests which are against it. So we came up with a third scenario, one that might actually be of interest and in line with some of the dominant strategic interests. It is that now if you claim copyright for something, you don't actually have to register it. If you write something, the rights belong to you unless you explicitly give them away to a publisher or to a television producer or whatever. You can't imagine a world in which a principle of registration of copyright would exist. In other words, digital rights managers, not governments, would become responsible for creating repositories of registered copyright material. Then what one could do in order to maximize the economic returns to the holders, the institutional holders of copyright, would be to negotiate a set of tiered licenses so that for one purpose, where there was no commercial use whatsoever in the minds of the potential user of an intellectual product circulating on the web, they could have completely free and open access and rights to recombine, republish that information on the net or anywhere else. And then you could have a number of steps up from there, so that the tightest would be the one where you maximize the revenues flowing back to the holders of copyright. So if you imagine maybe 3 or 4 tiers. In fact, although this would never eliminate that nasty word called privacy and what I prefer to call infringement, it wouldn't eliminate it. It would mean that you would have a clear competition, if you like, between the arguments of those who want to maximize revenues and those who would want to see openness in terms of the Internet. You would have a clear complementary set of values and preferences built in, not only to the network itself, but into the social technologies, if you like, the governance apparatus for how we manage, encourage this whole development of global information society's environment. And it seems to me that if you start talking about this and you actually start modeling it from an economic point of view, introducing it to people who are the various communities of practice, the virtual communities who actually are engaged in using the Internet, and you start telling them about, well, this would actually stop the squeeze you see on the music industry, or the problems being experienced by big film producers or what have you. And you talk to the other people who say, oh, we don't want government regulation of policy. And you say, but this would actually preserve the commons you're talking about. This would give you the possibility of experimenting and being creative with the new technology. Gradually, it seems to me that you have the foundations, the basis for moving forward in a way that is not so horribly contested as blood on the floor kind of punch-up. The one where you might be able to have a negotiation that is more politically acceptable, more economically acceptable, and much more likely to lead to diversity, not just here, but worldwide, in terms of the types of values and preferences that we think about. I'm almost done. Just to summarize, the purpose of this wider conceptual framework that I was introducing is basically to highlight the fact that there's a range of values and preferences that we could be talking about, that there are distinctive interests of the different actors who are involved, I argue, in different types of protections, and that we need to bring these people together around the table so that they can actually understand that. There's lots of options for the guiding principles, if you like, and as I said, that going forward in this manner would actually preserve diversity rather than making everything look the same. So, what do I think a successful World Summit on the Information Society would be about? Well, I don't think it would be about getting consensus on the joint text that it has square brackets around it at the moment. There's no consensus at all. There's this completely polarized debate between those who want to protect IPRs and those who want an open commons. What could come out of it would be the idea that the academic community actually does have a contribution and a role to play. It can result in policy-relevant kinds of discussions. That research could be done on the guiding principles that coexist in our information societies. We could actually be looking systematically at who promotes some developments, who resists them, and why. Because although I named a few terms and a few, throwaway terms like civil society organizations, that's not granular enough. It really isn't granular enough, not within countries nor across countries. What we really need is to understand what combinations of principles would actually underpin a more diverse, shared collective future, values not just the market, social welfare as well. And I think that means, practically speaking, international and comparative research at the micro, meso, institutional, and macro levels. And it means focusing on a few core issues, and I've been pushing the intellectual property protection issues for the moment. I think there are others, but I think this one is a profoundly important one. And it seems in that way there might be a hope of actually understanding what best use of these new technologies means. Not just in rhetoric, but in practical ways that come some way to addressing issues of poverty and social welfare, as well as economic growth. And I'd like to thank you for that.
We have about 25 minutes for discussion. We'll end about 2. But, sir, how are you doing?
Every day have conversations with my friends and colleagues about the amount of spam that we're getting. And it seems to me that what's happening here is sort of a parallel of Jared Harden's argument in that the economic resource that is being abused here, as it were, is attention. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that particular issue, since it's one that's been hotly debated by policymakers in this country in the last couple of months.
I think Harden's comments was quite different from the information comments in some ways, not least because he was talking about a limited resource, and in a sense, although perhaps there are limits to the openness of the internet and these kinds of developments, we don't know what they are yet. So we're not talking about a finite resource, we're talking about an infinitely expansible resource. That's one issue. We don't have the same kind of concerns necessarily. And then we have the bottlenecks, I suppose, of innovation, one of which is we haven't learned how to deal with people spamming. And there's a kind of a reaction in some places that says, we must have government legislation to do something about this because it's clogging up all our email inboxes and we can't cope. And we're going to have the idea that we have a total gridlock of the network because of spamming. I have a slightly different view. Not that there's a technological fix that can address the problem necessarily, although there are some. But that as soon as you get rid of spamming, we'll have another issue that needs to be addressed and another set of gridlocks as these technologies evolve. And that we shouldn't necessarily look to trying to clamp down on what is clearly a form of behavior which we find objectionable and intrusive. And rather we should find ways of learning and evolving the kinds of human capacities that I talked about before, which are ways of dealing in these new network environments, which is a risk, because I suppose there could be more than one company in the world. There's been one in the UK that said no more email in my business. All my employees are busy answering or getting rid of spam and deleting them and not managing their email at all, so I'm not having it here. I don't think that's very replicable. So my answer would be, I don't actually think legislation is the answer. Maybe the United States will pass legislation to try and get rid of spam. As soon as it does, that will pop another problem. Are you going to legislate against that too? Maybe. But at the end of the day, how are you going to enforce these things? And I think that then is the most intriguing issue. And what it's connected to is the whole notion of the amplification of risk, it seems to me. There's the notion that in these network environments, it's not only a matter of trusting that people won't treat you in ways that you consider to be too intrusive, like spam, but also a matter of understanding how the notion of risk is amplified. How close is it, your experience the same as my experience, in terms of the risk of moving into the virtual environments? Who feeds into that? How does the press play a role in terms of understanding what spam is about? And I think it's probably quite different in the UK than here. I haven't myself done an analysis. I'll stop there.
This has been a presentation of USC Annenberg School of Communication in cooperation with LA Channel 36. Production and post-production services were performed by Jerry Day Productions.